Welcome, I'm Josh Hayes, and this is Devlog, a series where I talk to game designers and developers about their process and ask some tricky questions about the state of their game. As usual, a big thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep this channel alive. More information on this at the end. Today, I'm talking to mod Kieren and mod Elena from the Old School Runescape team. Thank you both very much for joining me to talk about Old School Runescape. For the benefit of all the viewers out there, Elena, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your role within the Old School Runescape team?
Yeah, sure. First of all, pleasure to be here. It's super exciting. I'm obviously Elena. I work as a content dev, which basically means designer on Old School RuneScape. And I guess I work on lots of different stuff. I'm not like on a dedicated project all the time, for example. But I've done in the past stuff like Group Ironman, the Clan project. And most recently, I've been helping out on Tombs of a Mascot, which is the third raid in Old School.
Group Ironman was a fantastic success. My group still hate me because I don't log on and do any of the things I should be doing, but I'm looking forward to getting into Group Ironman later on. And Kieren, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
So, as you say, my name is Kieren, also known as Mod Kieren in our universe. But Old School RuneScape, or RuneScape, has been a big part of my life. I grew up playing it like so many of the staff on the product did. I joined Old School in the early days, really, in 2015. So Old School was only about 2 years old at that point. So I've been with the game for quite a while now. We've seen the team really grow from what was around 10 core members back then in 2015 to now. Like, it's hard to know the exact number because it's quite a large team with a lot more support from all the different teams around the studio as well. I'm the associate design director, so nowadays I'm sort of leading this team. I'm thinking about the future, where we take Old School RuneScape, the balance of our roadmap, and the different things we're trying to deliver, and so on. So, fun times.
Fantastic. In fact, that's a great bouncing off point for this first question. Due to the amount of questions I have to ask you and the amount of time this is going to take, I will be directing a question at either one of you specifically, and then getting feedback and input from the other at the end of that question. So let's start actually with that, Kieren. You were with Old School since almost the beginning, but my first hard-hitting question is, was Old School RuneScape ever meant to succeed? Because we know the classic World of Warcraft meme of you think you do but you don't. Old School RuneScape came about because of a vote, a community poll. It was put to the players, do you want this? And enough people voted yes, and you could see a list of what would and wouldn't be available. And now it's effectively the main game. When people think of RuneScape, they think of Old School RuneScape before what I refer to as RuneScape 3. Did you ever anticipate that this is the success level Old School RuneScape would get to?
Well, it's been amazing to see it succeed, that is for sure. What I will say is, obviously, I wasn't there quite at the start, so, I'm not privy to the entire thinking that was going on before it's launched, but Old School RuneScape launched basically on the back of a big community push. There was a big petition. Jagex then decided, let's do an official petition on our website that you had to have an account to sign and everything. And based on how many people signed it, dictated like the level of support the game would get. I think the honest truth is, at the time, Jagex didn't really know. They wanted to get an understanding of just how much demand is there out there, how much backing should we give this, and so on. And, well, it didn't quite hit the level where Jagex would give it future updates and all this stuff. Essentially, Old School launched with, sort of minimal support, amounting to bug fixes, quick quality of life wins and changes to, appease the community. But ultimately, Old School settled at a really solid, strong player base in that first year. And that led to a desire to, okay, let's see what we can do with this. The team at the time was obviously super small. It was like 3 or 4 core members. They were limited even by the tool set they could use to develop features for the game back then, but ultimately started doing sensible, smart updates. So they brought out an update called Nightmare Zone. They even then looked in like the repository and saying, okay, a month after Old School's back update, God Wars is coming out. So that's actually nearly finished in that old backup. So they tidied it up ready so it could be brought back into Old School RuneScape. And obviously something like God Wars, that's actually quite a big release, and it's something that players were very familiar with, and really, we've never really looked back on that since. It was the real start of Old School's surge in popularity and drove all the way until today.
Talking about the lack of tools that the team had when they were working on Old School RuneScape, and you mentioned the Nightmare Zone specifically, there's a cow that wanders around the overworld and occasionally wanders into the Nightmare kind of zone encampment, if you will. Is it true that you just can't remove that cow because the tools that were needed at the time to change either its AI or its pathing just weren't there, so you guys just decided to leave it in?
You want to go, Elena?
I mean, I've never tried to remove the cow. I've never looked at that code, but like, I can't imagine we can't remove the cow. I think that's a myth.
Even if you
I'd have to get back to you, but
don't. If you can, don't. Just leave it there.
Yeah, exactly. I have a sense that it's one of those where maybe initially you couldn't, and then you just kind of left it there as like an Easter egg to randomly
that
see
cow
it
is there forever now. We are not removing it, even though we entirely could.
And we all appreciate that. So let's actually go on to, Elena, the differences between RuneScape 3 and Old School RuneScape. So RuneScape as a franchise contains two major games, the live modern version that I refer to because of ease of access as RuneScape 3, and Old School. And the two over the years have advanced in wildly different ways in terms of UI, in terms of a couple of in-game mechanics, in terms of graphics. They are hardly the same creature at all. They've got the same click and move grid, and the combat system foundationally with the ticks are still kind of there. But when designing Old School RuneScape, how much inspiration do you take from RuneScape 3? Do you take ideas? Do you specifically avoid ideas? Do you write to match? Do you write to avoid? How does the existence of RuneScape 3 affect the development of Old School on a creative level?
So, first of all, they're absolutely different games, right? They've got dedicated teams working on each game. So, Kieren and I both work on the Old School version, which is by all standards really a separate game entirely, but it has that shared foundation, right? Like the core game is essentially the same and the history of it is the same, and a lot of the mechanics still as well, and the narrative of course. So when designing it, we try not to do too similar things to RuneScape, and there are several reasons as to why that is. First of all, you don't want to copy what they're doing because there's a reason players are interested in the two different games. If they wanted the same thing from them both, there's no point in having two different games. So if we do the exact same thing, they might as well go play RuneScape instead. And the second part is, a lot of the time, if we do something that kind of resembles something they've done in RuneScape, players will start to kind of be a bit worried that it's going to merge into what is now RuneScape. They might be worried that we're updating the combat next or something like that, which, RuneScape 3 is very famous for having done. So,
yeah, we will get onto the evolution of combat later on. I can't wait to pick your brains on that.
Absolutely. So there's definitely fear of going down the same road, right? But ultimately, there's a lot we can learn from them as well. They've done a lot of amazing things that we can definitely learn from. When it comes to the narrative sides as well, like I said, they have the shared history. And there's only so many paths you can take, right, after having that shared history. So sometimes we do the same as they've done narratively. Sometimes we take something they've built and kind of go a slightly different path, but we try not to contradict them, at least. Maybe just different interpretations of the same background, rather.
Kieren, do you have any experience or any kind of specific stories about the route that RuneScape 3 has taken and how that has affected you personally with any kind of creative input?
Well, I think there's a lot we can learn. Old School really does benefit from hindsight in a lot of cases, where we can look at things RuneScape's tried over the years, how they moved on from that point in 2007, how they handled power creep, how they handled all these different areas, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later on. But that's a huge benefit, right? They're very similar games, so there's a lot we can learn. And vice versa too, right? As Elena says, we're separate teams today, but we try things. RuneScape can look at it and think, oh, that works quite well for Old Schools. Maybe that can apply to RuneScape 3 as well. And even today, like recently, RuneScape actually took an Old School created character in Zuck and added it to one of their updates in RuneScape. So we've kind of done it a bit of both directions now. But I really do see it as like Old School and RuneScape were kind of two different branches of the same game, and we're sticking true to try and remain familiar and recognizable as that game as it was in 2007.
That actually leads me on perfectly to the next question. I'd like to carry on with you for this one as well, Kieren. So this is about nostalgia versus new content and the returning player experience. People come back to Old School RuneScape all the time. The old joke, you can never quit RuneScape. You just take long breaks. Yep. It's very, very true. But people come back because of nostalgia. They see what they remember and they want to relive it again, and then they play more, but then they want new things. And it's that classic problem of novelty versus familiarity. Players want something brand new that they immediately recognize and understand. How do you balance designing for nostalgia, which will permeate every single part of the old school experience, and designing to be familiar enough while also pushing into new territory? How do you add something brand new to something that has to appear already classically old?
Well, it certainly presents a unique challenge in developing a product like this, designing for a product like this. I would say that nostalgia can be a huge factor in people coming back. That sense of, it's so many memories come flooding back when you first log back into Old School and you hear that music on Tutorial Island, or you spawn in Lumbridge. It's like, oh my god, Lumbridge Castle, I remember spending hours just stood in this spot for no reason. But ultimately, nostalgia wouldn't keep people around for years. People continue to play this game, so that suggests that there's something far more in it, and there is a need for, as you say, novelty. We need to add new things, and it's proven in just the track record of this game that it's been adding new content, pushing the game forward, that's ultimately allowed it to grow, attracted more people back, had more people stick around, and so on. So I come back to kind of what I said earlier. Familiarity is the way I'd sort of summarize it. If it starts not looking like that game from 2007, then I think we've broken some of those principles. And so there's certain things that are just iconically old school. Like that Lumbridge location. God, if we can't mess with the layout of Lumbridge, even though we might have many problems with it, we really are afraid to touch it. We don't want to mess with it. And we've been bitten by that when we've even made small changes to it, like adding a pub to Lumbridge was controversial because it's so important to people's nostalgia. But things like 99 in a skill, the look of the game, that sort of yellow text that appears above your head when you talk, the skill system, these grindy long-term achievements, all of these things are so core to the identity of Old School. Those are the kind of things that need to remain, as I say, familiar.
I mean, that text is so iconic that even when you see it used in other YouTube videos, other media, even other games as a joke, you're like, that's RuneScape text right there. You've managed to take a single font and a single color and tie that forever to the game. Elena, what kinds of issues would you, because you've been working on raids, and raids are not something that Old School RuneScape was traditionally known for many, many years ago. People wouldn't say, hey, let's play RuneScape and go raiding. It was always, let's go fishing, let's go woodcutting, let's go and kill maybe a world boss like the God Wars. How has bringing an experience as iconic to MMORPGs as raiding to Old School RuneScape been?
It's certainly a different challenge, right? In a way, we have to rethink a lot of things, right? Because you see the traditional raids in other MMOs are usually end game, right? Whereas with this, you can't reasonably expect every player who accesses this raid to be max combat. What we're trying to do is actually make it way more accessible so that people at, just getting into combat can actually have a go at it. They might not, be very efficient, and they might not get the best loot yet, but they can still try. And that's something that we've really tried to push for to make it more accessible. I think you don't really need to keep as true to nostalgia, I guess, when making brand new content in the game like that. Because obviously you didn't have a raid back in 2007, so you don't need to keep that kind of standard. But obviously there are still some things that need to be in. You can't, for example, change the text, right? You can't just go do that. But yeah, no, for sure. It has its challenges. I think it's hard to say what the biggest one is, but there's lots of different ones, right?
Talking about raiding and the idea that most raids in most MMOs require end game. That's the attitude that the MMO begins at end game. You know, you train all your skills, you get this high number, now you can go and play the game. RuneScape has shirked that design in many ways, in that the process of training is the game. When you get to 99, you wear that cape, and it's not a case of I can go and do this. It's almost a case of I'm done. That's the symbol that I've finished all of this. So you said, and I completely agree, that you don't need to be max combat to do these raids. Maybe soloing them, but that's not the focus on them. What kind of levels of combat do you think you could take the raid all the way down to? Because I'm always a big fan of the idea of raiding as a mechanic being available from remarkably early. Do you think you'd be able to design, or in the future maybe bring out a system where new, inexperienced players could get some raiding experience?
It's a tough one, because on one hand, you need to kind of differ between... so what we can control is the skills that are required, like the hard skills, right? For example, a level requirement to enter. We can just say there's no requirement and anyone can enter and just have a free try. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's ready for someone at that skill level. And when I talk about skills in that setting, I mean how fast you click the mouse, right? What your muscle memory is like, your game knowledge, your mechanical skill. It's very hard to balance mechanical skill compared to requirements. So at that point, you almost need to either change how punishing the mechanics are. Say that you set up a mechanic, and then if the player fails to interact with that mechanic correctly, they take some damage, typically. But if you do that too much with a low-level player, they'll just die and be frustrated, right? And especially if they have low HP, you can't damage them as much. They don't get as many tries. It's frustrating even sooner. So it's very hard to do that. I think there's a realm where it could be done, but I think I'd rather focus on maybe smaller encounters for players of that level, and then keep raids as like a more prestigious, a bit more higher level thing to kind of strive to getting to.
I look forward to seeing how the final piece ends up. I'm super excited to die many, many times attempting it. Kieren, let's just jump back. This is going to be a difficult question. This is quite a hard-hitting question. The evolution of combat. Let's talk about that. Let's address the big elephant, because a lot of players who played RuneScape for a long time, that was their big moment. I know it was a quit moment for me. So back in 2012, before the vote to create Old School Runescape passed, we saw one of the biggest changes to the mechanical elements of RuneScape. RuneScape had a relatively simple 0.6 second tick system with combat cycles happening every few ticks, and it was click and wait. But evolution of combat added skills, abilities, interrupts, cooldowns, offhand weapons, weapons-specific skills. It completely changed how combat felt, and it completely rebalanced the iconic combat triangle of melee, mage, and range acting as rock, paper, scissors. And this change was vast, and it changed the feeling of RuneScape substantially. As designers and developers, do you feel it was the right call to do? I'm not saying call out your friendly favourite designer. I'm not saying speak badly of them, but purely out of the personal gut feeling, do you think it was the right call at the time? And what lessons have you taken from the players' reaction to the evolution of combat whenever you consider major changes in any system today?
I would say it's not as simple as a yes-no. It was either right or wrong. I think it was particularly how it was handled and the approach taken to it, which is where a lot of the learnings have come from. So, in a sense, I think the RuneScape players at the time weren't really ready for it. It was such a drastic change, and the communication between like Jagex, the studio, and the players at the time was nothing like what it is today, where we are presenting blogs, we're talking to our players actively on live streams and so on. Even doing those simple things, I think, would have made a big difference and allowed them to get better feedback up front. But ultimately, RuneScape, I think we're trying to look at it like, well, what's one of the big problems with the game? The combat system was problematic. It looked fairly boring to a new player when you click on a rat and you wait 30 seconds while you see your character go like this with a sword and hit 0. It feels outdated. And that was, I think, part of what RuneScape were trying to do, is look to say, how can we take this forward into, the 21st century and make this feel more modern, be more welcoming to new players who are maybe far more familiar with like ability-based systems, pressing keyboard keys to activate different spells and so on. But I think it was the lack of communication. the lack of taking player feedback as seriously as they might have, that was the fundamental issue. But I look at it now, and we've got the best of both worlds. You've got a RuneScape that is very much able to stay at that forefront, to try new things. They can be a lot more bold and stuff with those sort of things now. And players have come to love, the players who play RuneScape have come to love that combat system today. And you see the content they release, and it really is nothing like the sort of stuff we can do with our raids and our new boss content. And ultimately, Old School wouldn't have happened. It was one of the big updates that really drove that desire for, man, I really love the old system and I want to be able to play that as well. So now players have the choice. You have the choice of that modern system or something like Old School, which really has now embraced the combat system and all of its quirks to create some of the stuff like Elena has been with Raids 3.
Embracing the simplicity of the combat system is absolutely the heart and soul of making the combat more complex, because things like prayer flicking, things like tick eating, things like the super advanced combat stuff and complete armor and weapon changes, they are the soft skills, if you put it that way, the player skill level advancing through that. So big major changes need communication. I think that's a spot on thing to say. So let's go to another major change. I'm really trying to throw the hard questions at you here. And I'm not sure which of you two would like to approach this one, but we're going to talk about the banning of PvP and the removal of the wilderness many years ago when it was done in order to combat some exploits. So in 2007, the wilderness, the northern area of the map with the dangerous PvP, was removed briefly due to gold selling and gold farming bots finding way too many exploits in it. And the complete removal of that iconic part of the game was considered at the time a worthy sacrifice. Now, this action could be seen as punishing regular players who enjoyed that style of gameplay because of the actions of the exploiters. Systemic problems require systemic solutions, not necessarily individual ones, so I can understand why it was done. But no company ever wants to punish a legitimate player for the actions of an illegitimate one. How do you discuss these situations internally, and how bad does a situation need to get before impacting genuine players actually becomes a viable choice?
So I'd say there's not really like a cure-all in this scenario. You kind of have to take each scenario as its own case. There's not a right answer for every time, but I'd say the number one priority when you're facing this issue is you need to analyze how bad of an exploit is it, right? Is it a matter of, yeah, we can fix it next week, or it needs to go today? Do we need to take the game offline right now to stop this? If so, that is probably the right call, right? If it has a big, serious impact on the economy, I would say that's where I would draw the line personally. Stuff like the Tebow spawn. Like, I don't remember how long it was, but how long ago it was, a few years back. That was obviously cause for the game to be taken offline and for everything to be reverted. But as for the wilderness removal back in the day, it's a shame because a lot of people engaged with that, right? I think we had, I guess, something similar, because we had something called Bounty Hunter in Old School, which was an activity in the wilderness where you would enter this big PvP area, open world PvP, and you would get assigned the target to go kill. And if you kill that target, you get some points. The points you could spend in a rewards shop, and then those points, or the reward shop, would basically give you stuff you could sell for GP, for gold. But the problem with this was that people kind of figured out that, okay, if I have, let's say, 100 accounts and I put them all in the wilderness, the chances of me going to face one of my own accounts is quite high. So you could kind of game the system to always fight your own accounts, and it was really exploited that way, which ended up with us removing it, right? And we still haven't put it back, but we know that's something that players want. So now it's kind of up to us really to figure out, how can we give that back to the players by removing that exploit. It's not been a time-sensitive thing because there are other PvP activities that players can do in the meantime. So it's not as big as, removing the entire wilderness. But if it were, I would say the priority would be much higher, right? You would want to keep those people engaged and back into the game immediately. But with this, I would say we want a good solution before putting it back in, because if we just half-ass it, what's the point,
Kieren, I'd like to approach you with a very specific example of things that are happening in the wilderness. And I know that I'm throwing hard questions at you now, but I don't want to give you softball questions. I don't want to ask easy questions. Let's talk about the Revenant caves in the wilderness. Now, regular players of Old School Runescape will know exactly what I'm on about, but I'll give a brief breakdown. This is about the crossover of exploitation and regular players. So the Revenant caves is an area of the wilderness where you can kill extremely dangerous but extremely profitable monsters, but it's also player versus player. Now, this is quite weird because players are always telling me that they want emergent gameplay. They like the idea of players deciding what can happen, but they also like the idea of a player-controlled economy or player-controlled cities and towns or bastions. And we can actually see with the Revenant caves what happens when you give players the ability to do emergent gameplay and control an especially lucrative zone. It effectively becomes an online mafia. So large clans prevent access to the Revenant caves by simply killing any player that goes there unless you pay them protection money. So this is a whole area of the game locked off to the average player by other players. Not a hard cap in the game, not a soft cap, but simple wealth transfer. Now, many players would see this as emergent gameplay, and they would praise it as player-controlled, and others would see it as player-created extortion, locking game content behind player-created barriers. As a designer, how do you feel about the existence of emergent gameplay, and are there moments that you feel the need to step in and prevent emergent gameplay becoming player-created extortion?
Well, I'll start first off by saying, yeah, obviously we absolutely love emergent gameplay. I think this stuff is really, really interesting and almost speaks to the heart of an MMO. The wilderness in particular is sort of the one place where it could be a bit more of a Wild West. Anything could go, players can control areas and so on, like you say. I think the problem comes, and in this specific case with the Rev Caves, is where it comes so directly at the expense of other players, right? When players stop having fun, well, it might be emergent, but it's not good. No one's having a good time. They feel they can't play the content that we've put out there at all. But also, it's the fact that it was so associated with sort of nefarious groups, bad actors. Rather than clans going there for a good time, it was people trying to exploit that to make money and real-world trade and sell that gold off. So that comes into a whole different territory where it's like, okay, we do actually want to stop that kind of activity. That isn't good for the game. But there was a balance, and I don't know the solution for these kind of cases off the top of my head, but I would love to find ways to probably sort of empower that kind of gameplay in a good way, because I do think it sounds really interesting. But yeah, we made a bunch of changes to the Revenant caves that made it a little less lucrative. We made it single-way combat rather than multi-way, so clans couldn't just all pile single player, things like that. And now it's very different to what it was, but it absolutely has lost something. There was a magic to the way that things happened before, but before it got to that point of it almost being like a mafia, as you say.
Chaos is enthralling. It's absorbing to watch these kind of situations unfold. I almost refer to it as Eve, the online space game Eve. It's the most amazing game to watch. Not necessarily to play, but to just watch the situations. And RuneScape for a long time did have these situations that were absolutely thrilling to watch. Talking about emergent gameplay, Elena, let's link that back to the raids that exist in Old School RuneScape. There is one of the raids, I think it's the Chambers of Xeric, and every time you go into the raid, the kind of levels, the rooms are randomly organised, and this would see players repeatedly going in and leaving and going in and leaving and world hopping until they found the optimised route. And we know that players will optimise the fun out of a game, but that could be considered an emergent, efficient way to do raids. When designing anything, how do you design against a player's innate desire to optimize the fun out of a game, optimize the randomness? How do you still make the element of random fun and not something that they'll run away from for efficient rewards?
That's like one of the ages-old design questions you just asked me. Um, I can't speak to what the best method is, but I can speak to, how I see it, I suppose. I think you need some level of randomness to make games interesting, but you also need a level of familiarity to make it not just random, I suppose. You need to make it somewhat predictable so that you feel like you have a chance at changing the outcome. So, taking the raid, for example, you always end with the final boss every single time, regardless of the layout before the boss, which rooms you have before that. You always have the final boss at the end. And that sort of predictability, I think, is really important because what if you just didn't have that room at the end? You could have, vastly different raids every single time, but having that sort of final battle really puts an identity on that raid. And it's also like a good way for us to force you through that challenge, if that makes sense. So if we always want you to fight the Great Olm at the end, you have to do that. And I guess it kind of speaks to, so with raids, after doing a certain amount, you can get these capes that kind of show you how many KC you have. So it kind of speaks to, the skill of a player if they've killed so many Great Olms at the end. If they have, say, a cape that says, I've done 100 raids, you know they've killed the Olm 100 times, for example. That sort of thing.
How do we design to make sure that they go through all the content that you create and not necessarily the easiest or most efficient? Are there any bits that you've created or that raid specifically, whether it's the raid you're working on now or the Old Chambers of Xeric, and you look and you think, this is an amazing piece of content, it's just a shame it's being skipped over so much? Yeah. I mean, one example that I would look at is the temple trekking mini-game of going backward and forward from, I think it's the Shades of Mortarn is backward and temple trekking is one way. But people often, when they get the difficult levels of those, just skip them because it's easier to skip than it is to do the content. As a designer, what kind of safeguards are you trying to put in place that make the player want to play the content instead of necessarily skipping it?
Can I just simplify it too?
Yeah.
It's kind of just balancing it right,
Yeah,
if anything. Is. And to use the raids example again, I think we've seen it change quite a lot since when it launched. When it launched, it was so much better to go in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, and get the raid you perfectly wanted. And it was very specific. Now, it shouldn't be better to do that than it should be to say, okay, this boss is slightly harder or slower, but it's still not worth, it's worth just doing it rather than running in and out. To a degree. I think there's interest. It's interesting when balancing isn't perfect. If it's too perfect, it's boring. A lot of interest, and the process of optimizing something is fun. So it's that sweet spot between too optimized and too perfectly balanced that I think feels right. And the same applies to the temple tracking. I think it's just some of the encounters are just too slow, too tedious, and that they're not fairly rewarded for that time. And if they were fairly rewarded for it, you'd find people probably are interested in doing it rather than skipping it.
Is that rough around the edges feel can have a beautiful appeal, can't it? When you look at something and think, this isn't perfect, but I enjoy it and I'm going to go and do it. Let's move on to...
If I could go back to raids just 1 second as well. So we've updated all the different rooms in the raid so many times because there's always a frustration element, right? This room is the slowest. We never want that rotation with this room in. And then maybe we change that, right? So it's now a lot faster, but then another room is the slowest one. So there's always going to be one path that is, to some players at least, the slowest. There's always going to be a meta, and there's always going to be something that's considered the worst, I suppose. But ultimately, all we can do is, just gauge that frustration. Is this a frustration of, it's not efficient for me to do? Or is it a frustration of, this is annoying and painful to do, I'm not having fun? And you need to root out those pain moments and then just let the meta settle, really. You can't decide the meta every time. Sometimes it's better to just leave that in the player's hands.
And that, I suppose, is one of the the positive elements of the emergent gameplay, where you see where they're going to, and like, right, they want more of this, let's look into this, they want less of this, and you can take that information and grow from it. Let's move on to another. I'm looking forward to this one. This is a complicated question. This is about the Squeal of Fortune, and I can see you smiling already. So moving away from player-created situations, and these are more company-created ones, and anything you say, of course, is your opinion specifically. I'm not trying to get you to get the company in hot water here. But RuneScape never had microtransactions for a long time. Now, all the progress in the game was made legitimately within the game, and real-world wealth could not translate to in-game wealth. You could buy a membership, but you couldn't buy 4 or 5 memberships to train 4 or 5 times faster. This attitude was extremely appealing to the majority of players. I'd say Jagex cultivated a player base of people who valued the fairness up until the 28th of February 2012, when the Squeal of Fortune was introduced, a loot box style gambling thing where you could buy spins on a wheel to get stuff, and the rewards ranged from, I think, 200 million gold coins to experience lamps to lucky versions of rare items that were bound to your character. Now, I've discussed before about the idea of companies making brand deposits and brand withdrawals. Brand deposits when you do something positive and the player base likes you, and then brand withdrawals when you do something that the player base don't like. And I think the Squeal of Fortune, the first microtransaction, was a major brand withdrawal against Jagex's image with the player base. Now, Old School Runescape does not have any of these. And players have speculated that one of the reasons people wanted Old School RuneScape so much was to return to a time before microtransactions. And Old School RuneScape is seen as the bastion against microtransactions, the line in the sand. How do you feel about the initial player response to the 2012 Squeal of Fortune? Treasure Hunter, I believe it has now in RuneScape 3. How did it change the feeling of RuneScape's relationship with the player base, and what level of responsibility do you now feel to prevent another egregious brand withdrawal? How are you fighting back against microtransactions, Kieren?
Well, first off, I would say I think the biggest challenge that RuneScape had when wanting to bring in this system back in 2012, and indeed to any game, like even as if we were to do that, which we won't, because that's not in Old School's feature, but it's transitioning from a game without it to a game with it. I think it's far easier when you're creating a new product, designing a new game entirely, to think about what are the progression, sort of, especially if you're selling progression, what are the progression vectors that are sort of paramount, they're sort of protected, they reflect your skill, your effort in the game. And in a lot of games on the market, be it like Rocket League or whatever, that's your ELO rank, right? That is absolutely protected. That is reflecting your achievements in that game. But they sell skins for your car, and it's designed from the ground up to have that, so everyone already expects that. This game in RuneScape, and indeed in Old School, progression is absolutely the spine of the entire product. How long it takes to level up, complete different quests, and so on. And so adding a way to sort of get paid progression can undermine other players' achievements. So as much as you as an individual can choose to say, I'm not going to spend on it, I'm fine playing the game without spending, when you see somebody else with that same cape as yours and they know, potentially they've bought it or paid to get a boost towards it, it feels, like a bit of a slap. So I could totally understand the frustration of transitioning from before it to after it. But you're right. I think this was, together with AOC, was one of the things that led to players wanting that old school experience, and no sort of paid progression, no pay to win, no microtransactions, that kind of stuff is built into the fabric of Old School, agreed across the whole business up to the top. This is what Old School is, and so it shall remain that way. But what I would say is I do think I can understand some element of it, in that Old School, and indeed RuneScape to a slightly lesser degree, are long grinds, right? It's thousands and thousands of hours to get through the game, get up your skills, complete all the quests, whatever it is you're doing, and reach that fabled end game we were talking about. RuneScape's got a bit more focus on that. There's a fair amount more at the end game, especially like boss content. But I can understand as a player if you're like, I want to get through those levels. This is wasting so much of my time. I wish I could just pay to get past it. And that might well apply to some people. the problem comes back to that undermining of other players' achievements, particularly for old school. And I would even extend that to things like cosmetics. Items you achieve that show off your status are so significant in old school, and currently you have to earn them. That might be the Infernal Cape, which is like the most badass looking cape in game, beating the hardest challenge in the game. If we were to sell awesome cosmetics, well, A, they'd have to look really good for you to buy them. Essentially, they need to look better than what you can earn in game. So, B, it undermines again the status of those things players are earning to at least to a degree. So, we feel these things have no place in old school, and very much is, as you say, it's like a sort of bastion against this sort of thing. It's so core to old school's design, that backbone of the progression system, that we ain't gonna touch it. RuneScape's made that move. I think we have to respect that. That's a move they made already. But certainly it's something old school will differentiate against RuneScape with as well.
It makes me feel very confident to know that I think we feel very, very similar on this. Elena, how do you feel about the process of that?
I was just going to say that we talked about identity earlier, and I think that's definitely one of the big identities for old school, right? Is that sort of meaningful progression, and I wouldn't want to see that go ever.
I'm glad that we actually think very similar on cosmetics as well. That's a totally separate conversation to have another time, but I'm glad that we are kind of on the same page with that. Elena, let's go to expansion. So RuneScape is one of the longest running, most successful MMORPGs of all time, and yet the content pipeline works very differently to a traditional MMO. Instead of major expansions which bring huge amount of content or huge amounts of classes or items or land masses in large chunks, it's updated constantly with smaller content. What do you feel the pros and cons are of larger expansions versus small constant expansions being added, and what do you think your favourite way to work would be? Elena, we'll start with you, please.
So I only have experience with this kind of release schedule that we're keeping in old school with weekly releases, which is really good for engagement, right? There's always something for the players to look forward to. They know that if they buy a membership, they're going to have something coming up soon, something new every single week. And that's really good for the existing players as well, especially people kind of at end game, I guess, where maybe they're a bit bored of the grind they're on and something new just dropped. And maybe they're not really the target group for it, but they might go check it out anyway because there's something new going on. And it keeps the community talking, It keeps them talking about the new, fresh thing. Even, like I said, even if they're not the target group, people usually have opinions about the new updates. So there's a lot of good stuff that comes with it. The problems, I guess, is that it takes a lot of time for us from like a production standpoint. The RC process and the whole uploading process takes a long time. Testing the final release and all that. I guess I'm kind of keen to see what an expansion in old school could look like, because I feel like we're at a point now where the team's big enough for us to consistently do regular updates, but we could probably also have a team doing, fewer updates, but bigger ones. And I'd be kind of keen to see that with a new area or something along those lines where we try the different models a bit and maybe find a good mix of them. I think that'd be super interesting, because what we're kind of missing when we don't do expansions is there's never a big surge of players into a brand new content, right? You never get that overwhelming feeling as a player of, whoa, there's so much to do, I don't even know where to start. You never really get that feeling. The only time I've had that as a player in old school is with leagues, the temporary game modes that we launch occasionally, which just change the rule set to the game. We don't really add new content, but we just restrict you to an area or to certain levels or something along those lines. So you need to rethink the way you play, but yeah, it doesn't add to it necessarily.
I've actually got a question about leagues later on and about how they reflect the YouTube and the streaming community as well. Kieren, how do you feel about the major expansion versus smaller constant update style pipelines?
Well, first off, it means you get a very different shape to sort of our player engagement, how many members we've got, all those kind of key stats. So you could totally imagine it, right? When World of Warcraft, for instance, launches their new expansion, you get that surge of where spike goes up, and then there's a gradual sort of decline back to a base level until the next big expansion comes along. But with Old School, it stays much more flat. We obviously still get ups and downs with how people change throughout the year, and obviously we do have some updates that are much bigger than others. We're about to launch Tombs of a Mascot, and that's our third raid. That's an exciting update. We would expect we'll be getting more players back around this point than we would up to a smaller release. So we'll still get a little bit of that, but it really does change how we work to the point that I think, weirdly, we resemble like a Netflix subscription model more so than we resemble most other MMOs or even games out there. And I see the real similarities in that, Netflix has this huge library of content, and they can release sort of, to simplify it, almost categorize it into two buckets. Like the headline stuff. So, Stranger Things, the new season of Stranger Things. Oh my god. Absolutely, they're probably getting a surge in membership around the point that comes out. You almost certainly guarantee that many people subscribe for it, watch it, and then cancel as well. But then they have a lot of the other half of their content, which is just more library content, getting the license for Friends and putting Friends onto Netflix. What does that do for them? They don't put heavy marketing budget behind it, certainly. And I would expect when they add Friends to Netflix, you don't see much of a change in sort of their current numbers. But it is really important, clearly, such that there's a solid value proposition for the customer to say, okay, solid library content, new exciting shows coming. They work together, and that's how I see a lot of our content updates. And it can actually make it really hard to understand, like, what does success mean when it comes to certain releases? Like, yeah, you probably don't see a surge of players coming in at the point it launches. It serves a very different need. That's much harder to sort of actually sort of articulate in a numeric sense. So it is really interesting, and it's something we do a lot of thinking about. But yeah, I'd love to experiment a bit more in the future. So maybe invest in some much more impressive sized updates and see how they go. But yeah.
Not every update can be the headliner. Sometimes you just got lots of ones that are the smaller bands underneath. So with the new raids coming out, that's going to bring new rewards. That's going to bring a lot of people getting very rich very quickly, getting the rare rewards, starting them on the Grand Exchange. And this brings me over to the economy. So there are so many avenues for gold and items to enter the RuneScape economy, from boss drops, Slayer rewards, quests or mini achievements, and the high level alchemy spell. The high alchemy spell is so integral to the balancing of how much items are worth. The complexities and the psychology and the discussions with economics that I've seen on Reddit around the high level alchemy spell and the idea of inflation versus deflation is ridiculous. But then you've got gold sinks, like the construction skill, which literally has an item called the gold sink in it that's designed to cost, I think, like 100 million or 300 million. It's something ridiculously expensive just to take it out of the economy. And then you've got the tax on the Grand Exchange. What factors do you look at when trying to balance an economy as complicated as RuneScape while avoiding both inflation and deflation? Kieren, we'll start with you again.
I think we need to do more. It's kind of how I'd start. I think it's something that we haven't given as much attention to as we probably ought to. The game is generally inflating, and I believe the same for RuneScape back in, if you go back to like 2007 onwards. There's so many players doing so many activities that all bring in a ton of gold, be it through items that are then like high alked or purely coin rewards from different pieces of content. And there's not much that takes out of the game. So you mentioned some gold sinks we have, but for the most part, you're trading with other players, meaning that gold is just moving around from player to player. The G tax is the biggest thing we've done to start really getting a leg up on these kind of issues. So, and this is obviously very familiar to most other MMOs and their auction houses. They've generally had a tax. We never had one until I think last year. So we introduced a tax. But what we also feel is really important is to introduce item syncs. That is something we actually struggle with far more, and it's harder to come up with ideas that will sync items. Certainly sync items in a general sense. There's so many items across the game. And when it comes down to thinking about what players want, they don't want to see those valuable items depreciate in value. They don't want to buy that epic twisted bow and have it go down in price and they lose money on it later. So what we did for the GE tax system is essentially we taxed 1% off everybody's trades. I put them into one huge pot of money. And certain items that we've added to this system will then get sort of removed from the Grand Exchange when other players come to sell them. So you, as somebody who might own a twisted bow, or go to the Grand Exchange, list to sell your twisted bow, and sometimes the system will intervene and say, okay, we've got this pot of gold here. Here's your gold for that sale. But the item then gets deleted. It's not going to another player, which is... It feels a bit weird to do something like that. In that case, we're actually putting some of the gold back into the game. So we're taxing so much, but some of it goes back in. But we felt it important to achieve that item sync, where there's so many of these resources coming in the game again and again and again. We need something to counter that. But yeah, I do think we need to do more. The sort of data we're really starting to look at in more detail is like, where's gold coming from in the game? We can look at huge, our analytics team's incredible. They do some wonderful reports that are really, really quite just fascinating for me to even look at, let alone actually utilize them. But where is gold coming from? Is it high alks? Is it monster drops, etc., etc.? What's contributing most to it? We'll even do like sort of classic like economic stuff, like a basket of goods. How has it changed over time to get a sense of inflation? So we'll look at things like these, and we're starting to take it more seriously and try and do this better than we have done over the years.
It's almost like a buffer zone, isn't it? The pot of gold that the game has, and you can then decide, right now, does the game need more gold? Does it need less gold? Does it need more items? Does it need fewer items? And it's almost that kind of curation between the player and the systems behind it. Elena, you're working on raids, and raids bring in billions. You look at the amount of the value that these items are worth. When you are sitting there designing a reward table, obviously you want to give every player 100 billion just for completing the raid. Congratulations, here's life-changing wealth. How do you almost temper yourself to make sure that you don't start giving out insane rewards? What process do you go through when designing what this effort is worth?
I think you need like different levels of rewards. So typically you'd want something that has a baseline value that you tend to get quite often, just so that you don't go 50 raids without getting anything that feels worthwhile, right? Because you could go dry and that feels really bad. So you want a sort of baseline that feels good. And typically you wouldn't want that to be a unique item. You would want it to be, something that is consumed, maybe like something used for skilling, a secondary for herblore, for example. And then you'd want to throw in uniques here and there, depending on, the content. For raids, for example, we have many uniques, right? So we tend to say, okay, these uniques, they aren't considered that prestigious. Let's chuck those in at like a kind of low drop rate so that it feels... You get them sooner and you kind of get more hooked on the raid, right? You get that dopamine rush way sooner. But then, obviously, the items that we do want to feel prestigious, you make those rare because it's going to take a long time to get, but then it's also going to feel really, really cool when you finally get it. And that also helps with the pricing of the item, right? Because, like Kieren said, this economy in the game, it's very much player-driven. We don't... Except for the GE, which is already programmed to do so, we never go in and change the price of a traded item on there. We never go in and delete items. It's all player driven. So this needs to be taken into account when designing the drop rates of stuff. As well as, the high alchemy value that you talked about before. How much gold can this item be converted into? Because that is the lowest threshold that this item will ever be worth, right? Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say.
So if people are using the Grand Exchange, that means they're not Iron Man characters. And let's talk about Iron Man, because I love this idea. Let's talk about limitation. I believe that limitation breeds creativity. If you are forced, I think Old School Runescape is a perfect example of that. If you are forced to exist and create within a confine, you will find every possible thing you can do within that confine. You can't just say, oh, we'll fix it later, we'll find something else later. You have to find what's there now. And RuneScape has self-imposed limitation through the Ironman gameplay mode, and more recently the group Ironman, Elena, that you've been working on as well. You can't trade with other players, you can't pick up drops from others not in your team, or even Ultimate Ironman, where you can't use your bank, which is insane. And when you're discussing these limitation modes, which are worth your time as programmers to actually hard program into the game, and which are just silly systems that players are asking for now that you know don't really have a shelf life, like no teleport mode man, or area locked accounts, adding a hunger and thirst system that everyone seems to suggest for every game ever. Which limitations are worth designing, which aren't, and why is Iron Man mode, which is a single-player experience within an MMO, why is that so popular? Let's break that question into two parts. First of all, Kieren, which limitations are worth designing in?
Well, to use Iron Man as the first example, that's the first major game mode we added. But it's driven by the community at its core. So Iron Man, it came from streamers like Boaty and Foe, who basically did unofficial Iron Man accounts. So they weren't actually restricted, but they self-imposed those restrictions to experience the game in a different way. And through the process of them playing those accounts, and it popularized it, obviously, with their audiences really enjoyed seeing, well, how does the game play if you're playing it in this way? But at the same time, it also lets us realize, actually, this actually works quite well. So look, most of these cases, though, where we're adding things like this, we already have demonstrable proof that it works, or we understand what the limitations are. Does it make the game interesting? Does it just make it tedious? Because sometimes it's a bit of both, and you've got to have some trade-off. But Iron Man really does enhance different parts of the game, and content that you would never do on a normal account because you would just go to the Grand Exchange and buy it suddenly has value. So you play different parts of the game that you just wouldn't play on a normal account. And this game is about goals and achievements. Those all feel so much better. They feel so amplified when you achieve these things with further limitations. It's essentially playing on a hard mode difficulty setting to a degree, right? Yeah. You get that 99 herb lore. God, it feels good because it's such a pain to do on an Iron Man. And sort of touching on the single player element, kind of think RuneScape's always kind of been a single player like MMO, even before Iron Man. So much of the game is about that journey of your character progressing up the levels, completing the quests, and so on. That it is an individual journey. What is your next goal? Do you want to unlock the ancient spells and complete Desert Treasure? Do you want to get the Rune Plate Body and beat Dragon Slayer? Whatever it is, that's about you. It's about what you want to do. So what you need to do to get there is very much linked to you. So you don't often do much with other players, and it is something we're trying to do more of. I think a lot of the content is kind of anti-other players, right? You're chopping trees. You don't want somebody else next to you because it means the tree's going to fall down quicker. That's not good for you. So we're trying to add more content that is far more social friendly to do in a group of people, with your friends, with strangers, such that you can chat to them at the same time. But it's a really interesting topic. We could talk about it for hours, I'm sure. But
the mining,
Elena, do you want to? Sorry.
The mining and smithing rework was a perfect example in RuneScape 3 of how you can encourage people to mine and smith together because it now isn't competing with people. But Elena, how do you feel that RuneScape approaches being a single-player game? And from like a raid's point of view, someone's going to solo this raid at some point. When you're designing it, do you design and think, we've got to make it solo possible, we've got to make it solo friendly at some point? We literally can't have a mechanic that you can't do solo because someone's going to try and do it. How do you feel about RuneScape being a solo game?
I think it's very much a solo game set in a multiplayer world. And like Kieren said, we're kind of working against that now. We're trying to do more group activities and stuff, but traditionally it is very much solo focused, which at its core isn't necessarily bad. It just means that, you have that meaningful progression still at its core, and that's very hard to fit in if you're progressing as a group, right? Because people usually progress at different levels. I'm sure we've all been there, where you start a new game with someone and then they can't put in as much time as you, or the other way around, and then someone suddenly is level 30 while you're at 5, right?
Same as
So
Josh letting down his group Ironman group,
yeah,
right?
for example, right?
Yeah, I logged back in and I'm still doing Rune Mysteries, and I checked the Ironman bank and they've got a full Barrows set, and I thought I can't even wear it yet. Sorry, Elena, carry on.
All good. Where was I?
Quick question. Has Raids 3 been soloed by any of the developers yet? When you were designing it and developing
has.
it, has been soloed, so it is physically possible to do.
It is.
Oh, we're going to see who does it first then.
It's going to be super interesting. It has, without going too much into raids, it has different difficulty settings that you kind of enable yourself. So it's very much up to you how hard the raid really is. But no one's been able to solo it at, the hardest difficulty yet. I don't even know if any player will on launch. So that's going to be super interesting to see for sure.
You just laid a gauntlet down now. You've just you've called out the entire community of soloing Raids 3 when it comes out. Let's talk about the challenge runs that have almost transcended the RuneScape community and broken out into the greater world, if you will. Things like Swampletics, leveling through Mauritania up to the Theatre of Blood, and then the region locked, then tile locked, and things like by release, where the quests are done in a specific order. Old School Runescape seems almost to be the premier game for challenge runs within MMORPGs, or content lock runs. What elements of design make Old School Runescape so ripe for these self-imposed challenges, and how do you feel when those challenges leave the RuneScape social bubble and begin to appear in news sites like PC Gamer or Forbes? Kieren, what's it like to see RuneScape escape RuneScape's kind of bubble?
I can't lie, it's pretty awesome to be a part of it and really see like Old School reach to the sort of wider media, get attention from big gaming press and so on. I mean, obviously it's quite awesome to be sort of so core and part of that product. Especially, I feel so happy for people like Settled, who did Swampletics and so on, to sort of get that notoriety on the back of it, because I mean, we all know how much time he put into that series, and it's a lot. It's thousands and thousands of hours grinding away to produce those kind of epic videos. But I think Old School's really sort of ripe for it, just because the game is kind of sandbox in nature. There are so many options available to you in terms of what goals you set, what restrictions you can impose on yourself, because the game really is this huge spider web of like interconnected content. You want to do this, you do that to unlock it. You want to do this, you need those skills to do it. So when you might set a goal like I was saying earlier, like beat Dragon Slayer, get your rune plate buddy. Well, to do that, all of a sudden you need some combat levels so you can beat the boss. You need to get 32 quest points. There's a lot of options to get 32 quest points. And so it quickly unravels into this sort of list of different things you need to do. But you don't have to choose to do Dragon Slayer. You could choose something entirely different. So you really do forge your own path. And I think that really does open it up to you can play the game in any way you really see fit. And obviously, we've seen a huge amount of creativity in the community. I absolutely love seeing it. I really want to keep on embracing it. Getting back to what we were saying earlier, like if sort of restricted modes that players do really do work, I'm all for sort of making it official, because it brings it to so many more players who can suddenly feel empowered to give that a go as well, following in the footsteps of like their favorite creators.
Elena, how do you feel that, or what do you feel that RuneScape has done, maybe differently to any other MMORPG, that makes it so appealing for people to do silly, strange runs and for the audience to be so enthralled watching them? What is that magic that RuneScape's got that allows this to happen?
I think part of it is like the simplistic nature of the game itself. You know, it's point and click by nature. You click to where you want to go. The combat's super easy. You click on an NPC and then you wait till combat's over, essentially. And I think that just allows you to, and the world it's in as well, I suppose. But I think it allows you to just do so much more with it and kind of choose your own paths, if that makes sense. So like, you have some restrictions, but you don't have that many in the game. Like we talked about before, there are some that are kind of mechanical restrictions where you're limited by your own skill. But there aren't that many places where you're actually limited by skills that the game requires you to have. And that allows you to put on all of these challenges for yourselves, to put on your own limitations to the game.
The fact that the game can be played in such a limited manner, I think also speaks very highly of the variety of content that's available in any given area. If you can take a character into a very small region-locked area and still have a very fulfilling gameplay experience, it's almost a great example of, hey look, RuneScape isn't content A, content B, content C, content D. It's everything it's got in almost every place. Now,
absolutely.
I want to throw a very specific one to you. Have you seen the video about Snailman mode?
I actually haven't. I think Kieren he's smiling. I see him smiling.
I think this is what a story this is. All the way back from that like sort of original like troll post online years ago. Like, what if I give you $1 million and everything you could ever want, but for the rest of your life, 2 snails will follow you around. If they touch you, you're dead.
Yeah.
It's just become this meme now in the old school community, to the point that somebody has created a plugin on one of our third-party clients, RuneLite, to actually play in a Snailman setting, where there is a sort of AI snail that's super intelligent that is following you around the game, and if it touches you, you lose your Snailman status. It's hilarious.
The reason I want to bring this up is not
community creation is so great.
In no way am I, or is this kind of video sponsored, but it was Idle. It was Idle RS, the guy that made it. I went to watch his video. Phenomenally funny video. Perfect example of emergent gameplay. Is that the kind of thing that you would consider when you look at and go, hey, maybe more players want this? Or are you going to let it rest for a bit and see how many people actually try and make Snailman mode videos?
I think Snailman's more of a meme than a serious offering. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. If that really took off, why not? Because this is it. Why not? If players are having fun to a degree, I don't care if it's a meme or if it's serious in nature. That's good. If players want to play it a certain way, hell yeah, I'm all for it.
I downloaded it and gave it a go, and it's anxiety-inducing. I mean, I was just standing in the Grand Exchange when I turned it on. Anxiety immediately. So let's talk about the idea of bringing stuff into Old School RuneScape, because it goes through content voting, the community vote. Old School RuneScape updates are proposed by the design team, and then the player base votes on what they want. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's a 75% majority is needed for a vote to pass. So the player base is effectively steering the game's direction by majority vote. Now, this community focus has actually stopped several bad updates from happening. It's kept the integrity of the game, but equally it's also stifled potential creativity and potential future updates from happening. I mean, you've got no broken weapons, which is great, but we've also got no new skills. As designers, when you give the community a choice, when you give them authority over your ideas, how much anxiety do you feel for that? Is that a good idea? Are there moments that you feel the game has missed out on good content, which may not be great now, but had the potential to be great later, because the players voted against it?
I don't know who goes first.
Elena, let's go for you. When you're looking at the community vote, how do you feel about giving players that much authority?
Wow. It's a big question, right? I think it's the whole polling system is so unique. So there's not really like another game to look at for how they do it. And we've just kind of been paving the path for how to do it for such a long time now. Ever since the game was, or the game's always been big, but ever since the team was really tiny, I think it kind of just ties back to like its roots of the game, right? How it came into existence because of a poll, and since then every update has become, part of the game because of a poll. I think there's something beautiful about that. It's also a big part of its success, right? I think a lot of the players kind of had a mistrust against the company after certain um, updates in the past, and kind of felt more comfortable feeling like they're more in charge of the updates that go in. At the same time, it's like a soft encouragement for us to keep talking to the players and kind of steer us in the right path and make sure that we're doing the right thing. As well as it holds us accountable for stuff as well. Because we know that when I'm designing stuff, I know that whatever I do has to pass a poll. That's always in the back of my head. So I know that like I can't half-ass this. This has to be good, because if it's not going to be a thing. It's not going to get into the game.
When you are putting out a potential update, Kieren, let's go to you with this, and it doesn't pass, how do you deal knowing that you could have had the foundation of something great here? I mean, I like the idea of warding. I like the idea of a new skill, but it seems that you've got the elements of spite voting, you've got the elements of people voting against new skills because they're already maxed and they want to max again. What roadblocks do you see the voting system as actually throwing up against you as a designer?
Well, I think that, sticking with this sort of theme of the bad sides, the cons, yeah. It takes away surprise. So as the designer, right, everyone knows kind of most of the details about what we're about to release. The whole process actually takes quite a lot of time. Obviously, we're spending time designing something, and we've got to get quite a lot of meat on that bone to offer players. We're not simply asking, do you want this? Yes or no. It's, do you want this? Do you want this detail of this? Do you want this detail? With a full blog sort of outlining the design for a project. So it costs a lot of time. There's the spite voting thing you say. It particularly gets into really treacherous territory around things that are bigger, more complex, different from what we've done before. So a skill is the one you just mentioned. This ain't no secret. We would really love to do a skill, and hence why we've tried several times in the past. It's something we're still keen on and want to explore again soon. But it's so complex. People want to have a sense of understanding what something is, but a skill's so interwoven into the game. There's so many different aspects to a skill. How you train it, how fast is the skill, what are the rewards, and how do they interface with the rest of the game. So it's scary, combined with takes a lot more reading and digesting of info to really understand it. And now I see it as it's on us as the game's designers, the team behind the game, to put across the players and sell them on that journey. Like, why do we want to do this? How do we see the future of Old School looking with such a thing? Because I do think it's exactly as you say, particularly with a skill, they're foundational to future content. We can tell stories on the back of it. We can build new systems and game additions onto that skill. And no skill comes out complete, and no skill's ever finished, because we can always add more stuff. So, yeah, I'd kind of ultimately summarize, like, polling's a key part of Old School. It's probably going to stay, but I think 10 years in, we've learned a lot. We've made a few small alterations. We've even experimented with sort of restricting voting to only the players it will affect. The difficulties in that is defining who it affects versus who it doesn't. But I think the real important thing we've learned from all of this is it's communicating that's important. Not necessarily the actual act of adding a yes-no vote. It's the fact that we're putting out there and putting a blog out there, get an understanding. Do people like this idea? We get on the Q&As and talk to them in more depth. It's that understanding that, yeah, players are really keen on this. And it's stopped us from making mistakes. It has made content better. It stopped us from doing things that wouldn't have been good for the game. So that's where I see we've gained so much from it. But largely, you can achieve a lot of that just from purely being willing to talk, being open with your players, and at the end of the day, so many of the team are players themselves. We do have a fairly good read on how we expect things to go. So what I'll come back to is where it stifles us is that ability to do the bigger shifts. And I think that's where we need to play with the polling system as well to really understand what's its purpose, how can we make sure that we take the right steps forward with the game if we do want to do a new skill, for instance.
You mentioned that a lot of the team are players themselves, and I can absolutely attest to this. A friend of mine, Shogun, on the kind of RuneScape 3 team, he finds it hilarious whenever I'm trying to stream or trying to play or trying to make a video to find me and then turn into a massive spider. I believe it's the Arachnus one, and it was a little bit frightening the first time he did it, and never gets old being chased around by various boss monsters over the overworld, and I'm never quite sure if they're meant to be there or not, so I always run away. Then I realise it's him. There is...
Next time I'm gonna spawn behind you as a snail.
Don't. Oh, I've got the download. That would scare me more than anything.
It's gonna happen.
So let's talk about the skills that are in the game right now, because I believe there are skills in the game right now that would not pass a poll. If you poll fire making, as it is right now, just burn logs, people would probably go, no, this is not deep enough to really be integrated into RuneScape. But fire making has been grandfathered into so many quests and so many systems and so many things that it's kind of needed now. What is one aspect of the game, whether it's a skill or a mechanic or an element of combat or exploration or UI, anything, that you as a designer want to get your hands on and rework because you think you could do it justice? Elena, let's start with you. One thing that already exists that you want to mould into a better version of itself, what would it be?
I do agree with fire making. I think that you say it has its place in the game now, but that's very deliberately. Like, we've added stuff to make it more useful because it was just, you burn logs, that's it.
Yeah.
You know, it had no use. At least now it sort of does, and we're kind of keeping that in the back of our minds. Like, try to make it useful now and then. But if I could get my hands on anything, I would say probably smithing, because I feel like the progression in smithing is just so wrong.
99 gets you a rune plate body, doesn't it? Which doesn't
exactly
feel right.
Which is very low to medium level armor, right? You need 40 defense to wear it, but you need 99 smithing to make it, which, you know, would take a normal player weeks if not months to get, which is absolutely insane. So I'd love to remake that. I think there's tons of space with the smithing skill as well to expand on that. So let's say rune got pushed down to like 40, 50, where it like kind of resembles the defense level you need. Then there's a lot of reward space there for future expansions and stuff we could add. For example, dragon, right? Currently, you can't smith dragon. Where does it come from? Let's find out.
We saw that in RuneScape 3 with this mining and smithing rework, which I think was one of the most positive changes to the game in general, and mining and smithing is now a phenomenally fun and interesting thing to do in RuneScape 3. Kieren, if you could grab one element of the game, whether it's a skill, a mechanic, or an element anywhere, what would you do?
The thing I've had a bee in my bonnet about for ages now is the energy system. And this sounds, it's mundane, it's the least exciting thing I could possibly talk about, but the run energy system is so harsh. It's so brutal when you start a new account and you run for about 10 seconds and then you're walking and it feels so slow. So that system I think really needs looking at all the way through, so that things like potions and outfits that help you with energy are still meaningful, but that we aren't so ridiculously harsh on particularly new players who don't have teleports to get around easily. They haven't got all these fast travel methods. They're the ones that are suffering most, and also the ones who don't have high agility levels and don't have all these potions, don't have all these outfits that help you. I think that system needs some love to bring it into to bring it into a modern standard. I'd say.
The energy system does seem to bring a lot of annoyance to players, especially in things like Underground Pass or some of the jumps in the Sophonem quests, where you're effectively just standing waiting for your energy to refill before you attempt to jump, which isn't necessarily the most engaging gameplay, but if you can think of a way to redo energy, please poll it, because I think a lot of people will be interested in seeing where that goes. Let's move on to a really interesting element. So Old School RuneScape released on mobile, and I still firmly believe that Old School RuneScape is the single greatest mobile MMORPG experience, simply because it is not a mobile MMORPG. It is a full-fledged MMO that you can just play on mobile. Not a plug, not sponsored, I just genuinely think it belongs on your phone. What roadblocks have you ran into knowing that you're designing for mobile as well? Have there ever been moments where you've made an amazing PC experience and you've made this incredible immersive moment and you've thought, this ain't going to work on mobile, so we've got to get rid of it? Kieren, can you give us some examples of the limitations that designing for mobile brings?
The biggest challenge is always about that touchscreen element, and also the amount of real estate on the screen. So that sort of top level interface is where all the challenges are. We need to bring something in that adds elements onto your screen. You know, it's got to try and find a space while not obscuring also where you're trying to interact and click to move with your finger. So that's primarily where mobile poses problems. But we don't try to be affected by limitations when it comes to content. So, I mean, keep talking about raids. I mean, obviously the big topic right now, we're about to launch Raid 3. Combat's hard on mobile. Things that need fast responsive, accurate taps on your prayers or potions in your inventory. You got to do those things fast. And it's obviously easier on a mouse. But we don't want to take that away, because at the end of the day, I don't want to make the experience inferior for desktop players just because it's going to have to be played on mobile as well. At the end of the day, most people doing raids are doing it on desktop. So I'd rather stay away from saying, well, it's got to be easier because mobile needs to be factored in. At the end of the day, what it actually does is create a really interesting challenge that we see some players go and say, okay, I'm going to beat the Inferno on mobile, and that's insane. But when you see people do those things, it's incredible to witness. But mobile excels so much of Old School. You know, those skill grinds, whether you're chopping wood or you're fishing, it works so well in those sort of cases where you're doing fairly light interactions with the game, fairly relaxing. And so a lot of people who are not just mobile-only players will use it as like a companion app almost. You know, they'll sit at their desktop, do some harder stuff, and then take their mobile with them and do some fishing while they're, you know, at the pub with their friends and whatnot. So it's really quite cool, and it's really helped us push and grow Old School at the same time as well.
I do
really
always,
quite interesting.
I always find it nice when I see those videos on the Old School RuneScape subreddit of someone's wedding or an event or a theme park, and the camera just pans and they're getting 99 woodcutting or 99 fishing at that moment. It just kind of, it punctuates it. There's an important moment in their life. Elena, what limitations does mobile have on your area of design? Do you ever look at something and go, there's no way someone's going to be able to do this on a phone?
Yes and no. I mean, people are way more talented than we give them credit for, usually. People will eventually probably complete everything in the game on mobile. I have no doubts about that. There's certainly times where we look at something and go, this would be hard on mobile. And sometimes there are things we can do to change that up, make buttons a bit bigger, try to, show as much information but in a more compact way. Or even, make mobs larger, objects in the game more easily clickable and that sort of thing. But overall, I see it as you always have the option to play on a PC. You don't have to play on mobile. I mean, some people only play on mobile, and that's fine. But ultimately, it is made for PC as well. And I think if there is a point where you probably should play this on a PC, I think that's also fine. I don't think we should necessarily be limited by mobile, but I think we also should always strive to make their experience as good as possible.
Talking about the launchers on PC, Jagex do have their own launcher. which I don't think that many people use because there are third-party launchers which are superior in many ways. I think RuneLite is one of the most popular ones. In fact, there was an old advert, I think around Christmas time, the kind of side banner ads, and it was for Old School Runescape, and there was a regular style character sat at an old CRT monitor, one of those big deep ones, playing on RuneScape. But if you looked carefully at the actual image, that launcher was RuneLite, because there was a very distinctive right-hand column, which is all the RuneLite add-ons and changes. The official launcher from Jagex is lacking in quality of life features. And with the increasing amount of daily or weekly tasks, the complexity of quests, the desire to be able to mark tiles, playing on a third-party launcher is almost encouraged. It's almost required now by the majority of the player base. How are you designing around that, and what steps are you taking to bring the Jagex launcher up to the quality of the third-party launchers? Let's go with Kieren. Let's go with you on this one.
Yeah, right. Sorry, Elena.
Go on.
I would say it certainly gives you a better experience. That is for sure. So it's not necessarily the point of being required, but it's so much in your favor to do so that, yeah, absolutely. Most people play on RuneLite. Most of the community recommend to each other to play on RuneLite. And most of us at Jagex play on RuneLite when we're at home playing the game. And to me, this kind of comes back to what this game's about. It's like the community is so at its core. And the fact that they've been able to, take a client this far, add all these features that obviously enhance your experience with the game. I mean, that's wonderful. But obviously, it's something that we've also embraced. So if you do download the sort of Jagex launcher, you can click on, you can select a client from it and actually just boot up RuneLite from within our launcher, but still have all the benefits of using the Jagex launcher at the same time. So this is something we want to embrace because, yeah, it makes the game better. It's benefiting us as well as the community. But at the same time, we just talked about mobile. Mobile lacks access to a lot of these awesome features like marking tiles or whatever it is. So we've also been investing in bringing a lot of these features into our newer client, which is rather than being built in Java, which is outdated tech for running a client in, we have a native client in C++ that is now available through Steam, through our mobile platforms. And we're starting to add these features. So you can mark tiles on this client. You can get the clue scroll helper on this client. Yeah. And we're slowly also bringing these features, obviously now, because they're on that client, also across the mobile. So the mobile experience is so far better today than it was last year, just because we've been going through and adding some of these features. So we're very much learning from a lot of the things that RuneLite have done as well. And we're trying to bring it up to a standard where more of our players have access to these things, because damn right the game's better with them than without them.
I think we've seen a lot of very positive player outcry when, I think it was the HD, 117's HD, and there was some kind of legal trouble with that, but then they went, release the HD, and everyone went, okay, cool, let's put this out, it's really good. And it has massively increased the general appeal. Like when someone says to me, hey, you playing RuneScape, that looks amazing. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing it through this. Elena, are there any things that you've ever seen people add to third-party clients and you thought, we need that? We need that right now. Or you've seen and thought, we don't need that, but I'm going to take that as inspiration and make something kind of better with it.
Yes and no. So we have a dedicated team who works solely on the client itself. And I'm not part of that team, so I'll be speaking for them, I suppose. But one of my favorite plugins, and everyone's going to hate me for this, but it's the Quest Helper plugin. Because the first time I'm doing a quest, I'm doing it without any guides. I love quests the first time.
Yes.
I hate them the second time. I just want it done. I just want to get to the rewards. I want to get to the area that the quest unlocks, or whatever it is. I want my quest cape. The second time around, I would want the Quest Helper. I think it's such a nice way, a nice quality of life to just be able to kind of speed through that quest and really be able to do it. But I would want us to, if we're doing it, to put on like, if only you could have like an account bound thing across accounts almost. Like let's say you had a Jagex profile, and on the Jagex profile it said, okay, you've completed Morning's End. So the next time you do Morning's End, you can use the quest helper, right? Something like that would be best in my opinion, but I mean, that's quite far out.
No, that's great. I don't know anyone that did Morning's End Part 1 or Part 2 without having Tippet or Rune HQ or Rune Wiki open on a second monitor and just being like, right, step 47, turn this crystal. Step 48, run down here. But no, You're right. No one is thrilled to do rat catchers for the second time. I mean, to be fair, no one's thrilled to do it for the first time. But I get the idea that it's such a boon to the community to be able to have that. Let's go on to an interesting idea of Rendy with the level 3 Zokjad kill. The incredibly low-level fire cape. The fight caves. It's almost a 1 hour long challenge to kill the Zokjad. It's not the most difficult PVM thing in the game anymore, but it was for a long, long time. And yet we've seen it killed by one of the lowest level characters ever through extremely clever manipulation of both the combat system and the damage calculations and behind the scenes stuff. What I love about RuneScape is how, as you were saying about, there are very few hard locks, hard prevention. You don't prevent underleveled or undergeared players attempting something. You let them try, and you let them die, which is fine. It's the way you learn. Now, as designers, how do you feel when you see content that's meant to be incredibly difficult cleared in unorthodox ways? Do you design to allow it? And adding on to that, what are some of the craziest things you've seen a player do that you thought were not possible? Elena, let's start with you. What have you seen players do that have just absolutely blown your mind in the game?
So the first thing that comes to mind is what you said, the level 3 fire cape. Just the sheer mechanical skill of not just doing it, but figuring it out. It's insane. I personally love it when I see these kind of achievements because it is amazing to see how far the game can really be pushed. And one thing I saw recently, it was either yesterday or today, someone had been able to kill Zuck, the final boss in the Inferno, without actually hitting him. Apparently that's possible. So he'd made it through all of the waves to get there. And somehow, without attacking the boss a single time, managed to kill the boss.
Was it Reflections or Rings of Recoil or something like that?
A good mix.
A mix of things.
I think it was the Vengeance spell that kind of reflects damage to the opponent. But it's tricky because typically when you get hit by Zuck, he has a max hit of 160 or something. And the player's max health is 126. So he will one-shot you most of the time.
But there were found ways to mitigate this. And what I think this really represents is, we've had a discussion before about complexity versus depth. You can make anything complex by just adding in way too many variables and way too many systems to understand. Complexity is not hard to make, it's hard to understand. Depth is different. Depth can actually be very easy to understand, but then interacts with itself in phenomenally interesting ways. I would say that Old School Runescape is deep because it allows things like this to happen. Kieren, what examples or memories have you got of either seeing people do ridiculous stuff or either design that you've been involved in when you've been sat there thinking, someone's going to break this, someone's going to do this in a weird way?
It's something that's sort of on our minds all the time. Like, the second raid we did, this is a few years ago, Theatre of Blood. We sort of intentionally, so it wasn't targeted at solos for what it's worth. That content was not made to be intentionally soloable, but we intentionally didn't add anything that would make it hardline impossible. Because we, in the back of our minds, were thinking about, let's not stop somebody trying. Yeah, they're going to have a rough time. Yeah, they're probably not going to do it, and 99.9% of players will never do it. But why put a barrier in place that's artificial and not really adding anything? Players will figure out that it's good to do it in 3-man or 4-man anyway. So why put that barrier in place? And obviously, that's what we've then went and seen happen. It took a while, but eventually we see, it's always Wooks. We see Wooks come along and do some insane feat of skill and manage to beat down the content or find some quirk of the combat system or something in the ways that different things work together such that they can beat the encounter. Another one was, again, going back to the Inferno, this like wave-based challenge with Zuck as the final boss. you have these sort of pillars in there in the room that you can use as safe spots. You can hide behind them, attract different monsters over, lure them into different spots. And somebody set themselves to doing the challenge with doing without the pillars. So you can just let them be destroyed right at the start and then still manage to beat the content just by timing the attacks of the different monsters and switching their prayers at the right times. It's ludicrous. Particularly just the level of attention that takes over such a long amount of time, and one click could be a mistake and you're dead. So it's astounding to see how far people push it. Wonderful to see it happen, and it's something we want to keep on enabling to happen. And sort of see it in a similar sense of like fight games, you can go in basically as a level 3. We could have made that require 60 combat because maybe that's what it's targeted at, but why bother? As long as we're not putting it. I think the other question here is like discoverability versus the actual restrictions. You know, we probably shouldn't put the entrance to the fight gears right in front of the new player spawn point because it's absolutely not intended for them. But for players who know it's there, they can go and do these insane challenges. So I sort of see it as not needlessly restricting content for no reason.
That actually links really nicely into the next question I was going to ask. So some of the end game content is some of the best things RuneScape has got, and some of the most efficient and amazing use of the combat system and all of the mechanics there. But some of the hardest content in the game is locked behind high-level quests that take weeks, in some cases months, to play, which means the greatest utilization of the game engine for some of the most complex content will never be experienced by the average player. Or if it's a new player, it will take them months to get up to it. And most players don't play an MMO that intensely for that long. How do you balance designing to reward the hardcore with difficulty and designing to reward accessibility for the majority? Elena, let's jump to you on this one. How do you find that balance between giving the incredibly skilled players the big challenges and giving the vast majority of the player base the fun challenges?
Good question. So I recently worked on the skilling update called Guardians of the Rift. It's a rune crafting update. And what we kind of tried to achieve with that was make it group play, mainly. It's possible to do solo, but you probably want to go in a group. And make it similar to rune crafting, which is at its core very simple. You get essence, you imbue the essence, and then you get XP, right? And then we added a level of complexity to that, which is this sort of decision-making aspect. So in the minigame, you have access to different altars where you can imbue this essence, and depending on which altar is open, and all the other ones are locked, you kind of need to choose which altars to go to, if that makes sense. And sometimes the best option is just to not go to any of them and wait until a better one opens up, right? But this sort of like decision-making is a new kind of mechanic, sort of, that I've started playing with, at least, which kind of is the third one to, you know, mechanical skill and the whole... I lost my train of thought.
The idea of knowing ahead of time the correct tactical decision to make within any given thing is definitely an interesting way of adding in almost like emergent intelligence levels of gameplay. You know, I know X is coming after Y, therefore I'm going to go and do that. Kieren, how do you do it? How do you balance, hey, we're going to make this incredibly difficult 99 required challenge that 3 people will see, compared to, yeah, we're going to just put something new in Lumbridge that everyone's going to see?
Well, sorry, let me think again. Our raids, right, they are the thing that's behind sort of the highest requirements probably in the game for PVM content. But they aren't behind as much as they could have been, if you know what I mean. So they are positioned where they are, well, primarily so that people come across them around about the right time, that they might start to think about them as reasonable aspirations. So Theatre of Blood, it's locked behind only a handful of quests. You can get to the Mauritania region of the map full of vampires, all that fun stuff. reasonably early in the game, and if you navigate your way down there, you can get to Theatre of Blood and start to take on the second raid fairly darn early. In that case, some of the quests help you in that they give you better access to the area, teleports and fast travel and sort of side benefits so that we don't restrict you. But we've also tried the alternative. So with the new raid, it is primarily locked behind several quests in a quest line. But to beat those quests is arguably less than it will take to be able to do the raid. So we sort of see the quest line, maybe 85, 90 combat is kind of recommended. But we know most players doing the raid are probably going to be towards the higher end. So you will get to that point and be able to discover it. You'll be able to get to that point and realize, oh my god, that looks awesome. That pyramid there with the new raid inside. I really want to do that. But first, I know now that I need to go and do a few things first. Level up some more skills, get some more equipment, whatever it is. But I do think this is not necessarily something that we've been the best at in terms of letting sort of newer players. This is something you say a lot in some of your videos. Letting new players sort of experience what the game has to offer. Some of these raids are obviously that some of the higher quality content we add. They really utilize the depth the sort of combat system has, and I think that depth really comes from a layering of different simple mechanics working sort of hand in hand. So, but we don't really present much of that to a new player. Something like prayer flicking is not really ever mentioned in game, despite the fact it's a mechanic that you can absolutely utilize. Particularly even lower level bosses, most of them are really old content, so they're not the best. They're not really showcasing what the game is capable of. So I do think there's something we need to put more of a conscious effort in to really expose some of this more to newer players right at the start of the game or as early as reasonable. But at the same time, we don't want to also overwhelm them by dropping them into a scenario they obviously are not equipped to handle from a skill level or from a knowledge level as well.
Talking about the idea of new play. Oh, sorry, carry on, Elena.
I think there's absolutely a need for having content of different difficulties though in the game, because you want that sort of easier access but also easier content for players who aren't that experienced yet. But you also want there to be content for them to aspire to reach. And even for players who are really high level and have done basically everything, for them to have something to do as well. Because they constantly crave a new challenge and often actually critique us for not making things hard enough, right? Which is kind of where the idea for Raids 3 came from, where, like I said before, you kind of edit how difficult it's going to be.
So you let them set their own challenge. I'm looking forward to seeing this. Talking about the idea of taking on new challenges, when we were talking to Chris from Path of Exile, they talked about leagues being super important to their game. Every few months you have a new league, and that's something that Old School Runescape has started doing now as well. So the time-limited league modes, or even the Deadman modes with the cash prizes, they make excellent Twitch viewing, and they make excellent YouTube videos, but many casual players don't even consider starting because they know they will be competing against professional YouTubers, professional Twitch players, people who play the game as a job, and they won't be able to keep up. They'll just watch it instead. So who are these leagues aimed for in a gameplay perspective? Who are they aimed at in a viewing perspective? And how could you make it possible for a casual player to keep up within these leagues? Kieren, we'll start with you. Who are leagues for?
So what I'd actually argue is that leagues are more for the casual player. They kind of work for everybody, really, in a way that Deadman doesn't. I think Deadman is far more about that competition, last man standing in that ultimate finale for the cash prize. But leagues is really about sort of spinning Old School on its head, radically sort of reimagining how would the game play if this happened. And we also give the player these really powerful, a huge XP buffs, hugely powerful relics and choices that let them power themselves up in completely different ways. And we really wanted to create a way that would just, players have been playing this game for years. A lot of our audience has been playing this since, in their childhood, in 2005, 2006. Let's give them a new way to experience it in a different way. So one of our leagues sort of used this sort of fundamental idea of area locks, but turned it into a sort of progression system. So you chose an area of the world to lock yourself to initially, but as you completed tasks and scored points, you could then select another area of the world to unlock. But it's just so radically shifted the way you think about the game, such that you really did have a unique experience. So what I'd almost argue is actually in the case of leagues, it really is kind of about the fun, that just core enjoyment of progressing through the game in a different fashion. And it does have a competitive element. You can compete, you can score the most points, you can get to the top of the high scores, but it's kind of a sideshow to me. So you will have a lot of those, obviously, certainly the creators of their Twitch content, their YouTube content, that will push it to the extreme. But what we actually see is a huge amount of kind of casual players jumping in. They can experience parts of the game they never normally get to because of how accelerated it is. You get to those high level end game pieces of content like raids, but you get to it in a matter of weeks rather than months and months and months of playing the game. And also, you're more powerful in that you've got all these relics and buffs. You can smash through these pieces of content in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to. So we've done 3 leagues now. When we're not doing them at such a frequent cadence, it's maybe more like every year and a half, that kind of time frame. But we really want to present something unique each time that lets you play the game in a different way. That's the fundamental thing for me.
One of the big issues that leagues have, and it could kind of deter the regular player, the casual player, is that because you're playing a league and you're on a different server than the main servers, you can't progress your normal account at the same time. And for players who don't have that much time to spend on their accounts, that can be a serious commitment, taking that time away from the progress that they would normally make. But then, the league is temporary, and so far we've not run the same league twice. It's always been vastly different ones. So it is kind of a payoff to be able to experience that limited time gameplay. But it does come at a cost, and that is something that we're looking into. How can we make this more friendly to the players? How can we make sure that it's worth their time, not just for the fun aspect of it, but could they, that's where the idea of getting points from leagues comes from at all. There's a task system in each league, and depending on how many tasks you do, you get a few points. The points transfer back to the main game, and you can buy some rewards with them. So there is some payoff, but is that worth spending 2 months of your time on a different game mode that will not, at the end of the day, it gets deleted after the league is over? That's a big ask for some players.
Talking about the idea of progression from either leagues to main or the main game, progression is one of the core tenets of RuneScape. This idea of pushing forward and making number go up, line go up, number gets bigger, experience good. But let's talk about power creep within this context, because whatever type of content you design, one of the driving force for players to do it is to gain power, to gain it and then essentially to keep it. Now, one of the reasons I love games like RuneScape, Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 is if I become super powerful and then take a 6-month break and then come back, I am still relatively powerful. I have not lost any of my power. My 99 fishing is still 99 fishing, and this, I think, is one of the reasons people are so comfortable leaving and then returning to RuneScape. They haven't been weakened. But the maximum level in a skill is 99, which means in theory you can only add content up to getting someone to 99 and then it becomes irrelevant. Now, you could just keep adding more weapons and make the skill level higher. RuneScape 3 has done this by going up to 120. But this is power creep. This means that slowly but surely you have to constantly keep adding higher numbers to keep people coming back. How do you keep the pleasure of the acquisition of power in check without the inevitability of power creep that this leads to? Kieren, we'll start with you. Power creep.
Well, you summed it up really well, right? Players care really strongly about it because they don't want to see their stuff devalued in its price, in their own power, whatever it is. So it's something that Old School has really paid a lot of attention to. Again, we get the benefit of hindsight of seeing how RuneScape moved on from 2007, what the things they added with the different prayer books, with their different weapons, and so on. And we've intentionally been a lot slower with how fast we've moved, the power level up in the game. And how we've done that is by really focusing on focus on equipment, like adding new equipment that fills different niches. So rather than looking at, okay, we've got the whip. The whip is iconic, one of the best weapons in the game. We're not just going to come along and straight up just add, oh, all right, here's the new level 80 weapon. It surpasses the whip in every single way. And then next week, when we add the new raid, add the 85. We'll very quickly run out of space and very quickly devalue those previous items at the same time. What we've done is look at adding things like the Dragon Hunter Lance. So that sits at a similar tier to other equipment, but it's only good on dragons, for instance. That's its kind of unique benefit. So it doesn't just usurp those other items in every single way. Instead, you have different equipment that's good in different situations. And so they all have value, essentially. That doesn't mean we won't ever do that full next step up and add the new tier, but it does let us do it far more slowly and carefully, time it right. Something like a raid is the perfect point to be able to say, okay, that really does justify that next step up. But even when it comes to the gear, we're often adding upgrades, so we don't just harm the value of the Abyssal Whip, we make it an attachment to the whip to make the next upgrade. So that players who own a whip and come back to the game in a year don't find that it's suddenly worthless because everyone's moved on to the next item. So there's a lot of different things we've thought about, but essentially we're focusing on horizontal additions to give us the ability to space out the more vertical additions over a longer time period.
I think the horizontal additions are one of the best ways to give your game longevity. We've seen it with Guild Wars 1, we've seen it with Guild Wars 2, and I think that's a perfect example of how you don't need number go up to be the be-all and end-all. You can sometimes have different graphics, different cosmetics. We talked earlier about achieving the Infernal Cape, and if you see a player with an incredibly cool-looking sword that's the same power as a less cool-looking sword, but they got it from somewhere difficult, it's meaningful for them. Elena...
Sometimes it's like different number go up, right?
Exactly. Coolness level
I think,
go up.
Exactly. I think we touched on it briefly earlier, but the collection log is huge, right, for horizontal progression. It's just a log that captures every sort of unique drop that you've had from any sort of creature in the game. And it's just such a massive driver for people to sort of complete the game. We have a lot of self-proclaimed completionists in the game. It's kind of becoming more and more popular recently with more content creators picking it up as well. And we see people do this all the time. And we recently, or within the last year or so, released combat achievements as well, which is, a similar type of thing. So all of these like achievement systems are really good for that horizontal progression, and it kind of lets us slow down the power creep that you'd typically get from gear being improved, and rather focus on all of these other things and really like pushing the different content that we have in the game and pushing that to the best of its ability, really, to get the most out of those things.
I'm a big fan of systems that encourage players to go and achieve things without necessarily forcing them to. People always say, you can do whatever you want in this game, but what that often ending up as is directionless. You end up going into a big world and thinking there's lots of stuff I can do, but until it's tracked, I almost don't feel the worth in doing it. But then you have things like the Varrock Museum, the Kudos, and then the Rag and Bone Man, with the idea of bringing all the various bones of all the animals around. It might not necessarily give you an amazing upgrade, but it's a thing that you can point to and say, not only have I done that, but the game has acknowledged I've done that. And therefore, I actually think it's got slightly more weight saying that I've done that.
I'd really love to do... Sorry, one last thing. I'd really love to do a completionist cape at one point. We've talked about this a bit before as well, but I think just accumulation of the systems that I mentioned before, as well as Rag and Bone Man, right, and the Varrock Museum, every sort of thing that you could possibly track that is by definition, completionist is a one-off. So if you can do something once and never undo it, it is completable, right? And we could track that. We could track everything in the game that is, by definition, completable, and gather it in one list. And that would make you do all sorts of crazy stuff, right? Talk to this NPC, unlock their weird extra chat option for no reason other than to get off the list. But some people will do it and find the enjoyment in that.
If you add the completionist cape before you add the champion max cape, there's going to be a riot. People are going to be angry because people have been asking for that champion max cape for a long time. Now, we've actually gone through a lot of the questions I want to go through. There are still some more, but it's been 2 hours. So I want to get the final look into the future. You don't have to reveal anything secret, but, you know, it's always appreciated when you do. We'll start with you, Kieren. Old School Runescape. Where's it going to?
I sort of see Old School Runescape as it's going to be here for a long time, right? We're 10 years into Old School next year. That sounds mind-blowing. It's like that time has just disappeared so quickly. We're 20 years plus, 21 years now into RuneScape's lifespan. The idea that Old School ain't going to be here in the next 5-10 years seems extremely fanciful. This game's grown from strength to strength. It's essentially bigger today than it almost ever has been. And that's mind-blowing. We're still growing. We've seen player growth over the last couple of years. That's amazing. So how can we keep on looking forward with Old School and really keep on amplifying going forward without... And I think, to me, it's looking outside the box. It's thinking bigger about the different ways we can present Old School. Things like leagues, I think, are really ingenious ways of coming up with, okay, this is something different that we can surprise players with. Let them engage with the product in a different way. So I'm sort of starting to think about like Old School almost like as an ecosystem of these different sort of modes coming together in smart ways that can feed back into each other. I want to leverage the players' creativity or coming up with these different modes, coming up with different ideas for the game. How can we, embrace that and build it into our product? But at its core, there's some things that will certainly remain true going forward, and that is, players want to see new quests, players want to see new skilly features, new bosses. Those are sort of the game's bread and butter, but we need to think outside of that with what we can do with Old School. What else can we do it? Are there short form versions of the game we could offer that let you get an experience that... Because there's so many unique things to Old School, the point and click system, the way our combat system works. Can we get that to more people? Can we get, these are the kind of questions I'm asking, so I don't know all the answers just yet, but I am really excited about what we can do with Old School going forward. And certainly seems what we've done thus far seems to be working, and I think everyone's obviously we're really, really happy about how it's gone, and I really hope the next 10 years of Old School are equally as strong.
It's definitely going to be around for a long time. Elena, you've had a lot of experience in multiple systems and multiple aspects of the game, so you have a very strong knowledge of where it came from to where it is now. Where do you see it going to?
The moon? No, I would say it definitely has a strong future, right? It's stronger than ever. It keeps growing all the time. Coming up on 10 years is absolutely amazing. I would say content-wise, I would love to see more of everything, really. I've kind of mentioned some stuff already, like the completionists cape, for example, right? I would love to see a new skill. I would actually love to see several skills. And I could go on about that for a long time, but I'm aware of time. There was one more thing I thought of. I can't remember.
If you do, let me know. I will add it into the video description to make sure everyone is fully up to date with all of this. RuneScape Old School is a phenomenal MMORPG. I've enjoyed it for many, many years. It's a massive part of my MMORPG history, and I cannot wait to see where it goes in the future. Thank you both very much for taking the time to talk to me, and hopefully I'll see you in game sometime. Don't disguise yourself as a snail, because you will scare me. Thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
A big thank you to Kieren and Elena for taking the time to talk to me. If you want me to reach out to the developers of your favourite game, then leave a suggestion in the comments below. Cheers for watching, and have a great day.